How many of you have ever talked to somebody? No hands went up. Surprise, surprise. Now I'm wishing I had gone back to the beginning of the semester and had those little, those little Who Wants to Be a Millionaire paddle buttons. What are they called? The little response, or you have to say yes or no. Because you guys are just you just don't raise your hands. It's that, or you're thinking, I got up really early this morning and I'm not certain about the infrastructure quality of my deodorant application, and nobody's hands go up. Either way, it's fine. But I'm assuming some of you have tried to talk to somebody before. Many of you have tried to talk to me. And, well, I tried to avoid that, but it's the way it worked. Human communication, though, very important, right? Probably one of the most important things we do is try to communicate. We do a lot of this verbally. But as we talked about a few weeks ago, there are considerable nonverbal components as well, right? I mean, facial expressions, body language. We're not going to have a huge discussion about those things. The other thing that we often do, and some of you are doing that right now in sort of different formats, right? Zane's using one approach. Adriana, you're using a different approach. You're using written language, right? And you're using a way to communicate using language in a written format. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Most of our conversation is going to be about spoken language, right? So that's where most of what we're going to talk about is going to focus. But we'll also talk about sort of it's a unique case. We'll talk briefly about sign language as well, right? And how that, essentially it's the same as spoken language, right? In terms of the brain regions that are involved, obviously use some motor cortex in some different ways, but in terms of the processing and understanding. So it's going to be exciting. Again, we're going to talk about production and comprehension. These are two separate things, right? We're going to talk about how those are two separate things. Okay? The reason we know they're two separate things is you can damage two different brain regions and you can get different deficits, right? That's a great way to know that there are two different processes, right, Andre? If it's the same process and you damage one brain region, you're going to lose both capabilities, right? But if it's you damage one brain region and you only lose one capability, different brain region, different capability, they're separate processes, okay? Again, we'll talk about some disorders of production and comprehension, and then we'll talk a little bit about reading and writing, which are going to be exciting. We will not, for those of you interested, get into third R, arithmetic. I don't know if anybody was excited and waiting for that one. No math today. Why the 3 R's? I think by the time you get to that third one, you failed the first two, if you think arithmetic starts with an R. Just a side note. All right. Language and communication, here's a surprise, are important aspects of human social behavior. I don't know if you were aware of that, but there you go. I've already said language is much more than speech. Not only are we going to talk about some of those other nonverbal things, but think about the verbal components as well, right? How many of you just think about the way people say your name sometimes, right? There are many different ways people can say your name. Right? Think about the ways your parents have said your name, right? And just the tone, the pacing, the volume of the way they say your name can tell you a lot about what's going on, right? So we're going to talk about some of those emotional aspects that are in language as well, which is going to be kind of fun. Again, we'll talk about symbols and a few other things, and then cover some specific brain regions. Particularly today, we're going to talk about Broca's area. How many of you remember Paul Broca? We talked about him sort of in Chapter 1. He was the guy who studied the individual who went by the name Tam, because that was the only word he could produce. Told us a lot about language production. We've got this guy Carl Wernicke in Wernicke's area. We're going to talk about that and comprehension. And then, of course, we're going to talk a lot about auditory cortex, right? Not a big deal. Just to orient you as to where we are. Okay? We've got Broca's area here in the front. What's interesting about this, how many of you know where the motor cortex is located? Here's a big surprise. It's right here, sort of toward the front. Broca's area is very close to that. So you can think about Broca's area and motor cortex speech production, right? We're going to produce speech because we have to actually move our mouths to do that. So think about motor cortex. Wernicke's area is more toward the back, right? Okay. Closer back there to temporal cortex, auditory cortex, where we're going to process those sounds. Wernicke's area is also going to tap in to some of these memory structures. We'll talk about that, why that's important. Could you imagine think about this, Riley, if every time someone spoke, it sounded like they were saying new words to you? That seems like that would be a real problem, right? And I think some of you might have felt that way at different times in this class, right? I have no idea what that string of words was. Hopefully, at least two of you have caught on to what some of those words are, right? So you can kind of move forward. So there's your brain. The sort of next thing we should talk about is, why am I only showing you the left side of the brain? Well, for probably all of you, except, well, maybe one or two. So there might be a couple exceptions in here. And it's going to be hard for me to tell today if there are any exceptions. How many of you are left-handed? Yeah, Celine, you're not going to be any help. And I can tell because of I'm not going to be able to see how you write. So if I could see how you use your hand when you write, I could probably take a good estimate about whether or not your language is in your left or right hemisphere. And so can I tell a Steve Maywalt joke? Do you know the Steve Maywalt joke?
Why would you not tell a Steve Maywalt joke?
So for those of you that are left-handed, there's a group of people called left-handed hookers. It's an extra fee for that. So the reason, and you'll see this sometimes when people write, so most of you who are right-handed, I don't know, it'd be really hard for me to demonstrate. You kind of write like this, right? You kind of have like your hand moving across. Does that look normal? Okay. When people are left-handed, you'll see them write either like the same way, which is something, or they'll often do one. I know, right? That's the face. I can't. That's what I tell people when they ask me, like, no, I write normal. What are you doing? So now I think there are two of us who probably have language in the other hemisphere. So just every time I say left or right, just flip it or don't flip it, depending on what's important to you. Does that help? Okay. If you are right-handed, and you are like naturally right-handed, I don't mean right-handed because you've had like some damage to your left arm, right? Okay. So how many of you know John Paul Jones? Anybody at John Paul Jones? Yeah, right? Of course you do. Phi Alpha Theta guy right there, right? You got to know John Paul Jones. Amazingly, the only guy to ever win a naval battle and lose his ship, right? So he lost his ship, but still managed to win, which is impressive. And actually had to take over the other ship he didn't manage to sink. His own ship went down. So I know, right? He's an interesting guy. He was a left-handed guy, but because his right arm got cut off. So that guy doesn't count. So if you're in that situation, that doesn't make you left-handed, right? So don't, just clear that up. So if you're right-handed, language is almost a guarantee to be in your left hemisphere, okay? So definitely going to be in the left hemisphere for you. No worries about that, right? If you are left-handed, the vast majority of left-handed individuals, probably 70 or 75%, actually have language in their left hemisphere as well. That's why you see most left-handed people write with their hands hooked, right? Because they're trying to, if you were right-handed, you would have your hand over, right? Does that make sense? I know it's kind of hard to demonstrate, right, without a piece of paper. If you do your hands like this, you'll figure it out. It's fine. For left-handed individuals who do not hook, right, so that's the left-handed hooker part, if you don't hook your hand around, then your language is probably in the right hemisphere because see the way it's crossed, just like if you were right-handed. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's a good way to figure out what's going on. So this is a great example of what we call lateralization of function, right? Some things are in the left hemisphere, some things are in the right hemisphere. If anybody says, I'm right-brained because I'm more or less creative, I'll punch you and throw you out of class. So don't say it. Because that's not true. Things are organized in your brain. How many of you remember that midterm exam I gave you? And one of the questions was, what's more important, Brain size, was that on this group, or was that the other test? Yeah, what's more important, brain size or organization? It's organization, right? Organization is so important, right? That's why all these people are now living in tiny homes, right? Size doesn't matter. It's where you put things, right? So you got to be able to like pull stuff out efficiently, and your brain's the same way, right? So we have a very well organized brain. That means we have to put some stuff on the left side, put some stuff on the right side. It's fine. As long as it's well organized, you're going to be pretty efficient, right? So language is going to be on the left side. We already talked about an example of something on the right hemisphere more than on the left, and we talked about it with facial expressions, right? So Kyle, you remember I said, go home, smile in front of the mirror, see which side smiles more. Typically it's going to be your the left side of your face, because you're right. The right side, your right hemisphere controls emotion, or has a bigger role in emotion, right? And what's interesting is later we're going to find that there's a small sort of like caveat to this, like not just the like are you left or right-handed business, but the emotional processing of language, some of that occurs and involves parts of the right hemisphere as well. So we're going to have to incorporate the right hemisphere a little bit to process that emotional component of language as well. All right? Questions about that? Everybody sort of know where we are. We are going to assume we're all just in the left hemisphere with language. We're going to live there. 95% of the time or more, you're going to be correct. So I think if it's correct 95% or more of the time, you can probably just go with it. You got a couple weirdos every now and then. Not a big deal. The first thing we want to think about when we think about language and production and comprehension is how did we figure out that these are different mechanisms, right? And largely we've done this by what we call cerebrovascular accidents, right? What is a cerebrovascular accident? Well, that's a really fancy word to say you've got a problem with the blood going to your brain. A blood vessel was blocked, a blood vessel was ruptured, and a portion of your brain did not receive the blood that it needed, right? And all of the nutrients and the oxygen that was in there, that part of your brain is going to die, okay? Lots of folks have strokes, right? So we think about strokes, brain aneurysms, you think about blockages, right? These are sort of the typical things that happen when we're thinking about cerebrovascular accidents. Why are they important? Well, they can often lead to interesting deficits, right, in your capabilities and your cognitive abilities that can give us insights to how your brain processes information. And language is this way, right? So we've had folks over the years who've had damage to different parts of their brain that are responsible for either language production or comprehension. Once that individual dies, or before then, we can do some imaging. We can see the extent of the damage. We can say, oh, well, this area or that area is involved. Here are the deficits for this individual. And we can figure out what's going on. Now, when this happens, and somebody has a problem with speech production or comprehension, we call it an aphasia, okay? Now, this is not related to deafness or motor deficits, okay? And that's important. This is not damage to the, remember when we talked about auditory sensory systems, right? Okay, this is not damage to that process. Okay, this is damage somewhere in the brain, typically beyond auditory cortex, right? That's going to cause us problems comprehending or producing speech. We're going to hear it. Okay, we're not going to have any problems actually hearing the sounds. It's how we process those sounds, how we assign meaning to that, and what we do with that meaning. That's going to be an aphasia. We'll talk about Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia. These are a couple of the big ones that we'll talk about. One thing to keep in mind. So I'm going to give you the story today that if you were to take a course on language, if you were to take another course, for those of you that go into the graduate program, if you take like a BioBases course or something like that, you might get a slightly different, more nuanced story, right? And you're going to get some differences. Often when you go from resource to resource, Morgan, and you read about Broca's aphasia, they will tell you slightly different problems that these individuals have. The reason for that, how many of you have ever been able to intentionally administer a cerebrovascular accident to someone and know the exact extent of the damage that it doesn't happen, right? Okay, you don't have scientific strokes. Okay? So we have to wait on something to happen naturally. The damage is going to be a little different. The location of that, the origination, the spread of the damage, it's going to vary from person to person. So if you have somebody who has Broca's aphasia, two people might be diagnosed with Broca's aphasia. One might be able to produce language in a slightly different way than someone else. It's just going to be the extent of the damage and sort of what we call anatomical variation, right? Your brain's slightly different than somebody else's. It's close enough, but things might be moved, a millimeter here or there. And in the brain, a millimeter can be the difference between life and death, right? So those small differences can make, sort of big impacts. The second thing that makes this problematic is anybody. What's the other species? Well, let's see. How many other species can we name that have spoken verbal language like humans? Keep going. I'll give you guys 4 or 5 years if you need it. There really aren't any, right? And I know you think about like, oh well, I can tell my dog to roll over and he rolls over, sure, right, whatever. That's not really like, language. Then there's, of course, we got to talk about Alex for a moment, right? Alex the bird. You can tell him to like pick up a green triangle and he can. Okay, so that's maybe like one bird can do this, right? Which is kind of interesting. You guys want to talk about Coco the gorilla? You guys know Coco? She died just in the last year, right? So she was the gorilla that knew sign language, that had the little pet kitten. You guys remember that? You probably don't remember it, but maybe you've seen it, right? Like your great-great-grandparents talked about it back in the 80s. That's when that was pretty popular. So anyway, Coco, she was a gorilla. She learned sign language. She learned a considerable amount of sign language, actually. Was able to communicate. Again, we're sort of talking about a one-off situation, right? I'm not saying other gorillas couldn't learn language. I think that is a possibility for them to do that. Other people have tried and they've not been nearly as successful, right? And there are some methodological issues there as well. How difficult is it for a human to learn language? Does anybody know? It's not, right? It's not difficult to learn language at all. And in fact, if it was difficult to learn language, everybody would go through an intense language learning program. Instead, we have that program reserved for individuals who have difficulty learning language, right? Most of us pick up language quite quickly. Some of you may have picked up some parts of language when your parents didn't want you to. Some people yell some inappropriate things, right? Maybe you've heard them at home or somewhere else, and you think, well, that's perfectly fine for the grocery store. Right? Maybe it's not. You don't know. So language is something, we pick it up quite quickly. If you've ever been around a small child, they learn language. I'm assuming most of you learned language without much difficulty, right? Now, when you try to learn a second language when you're 22, that's a different story, right? That's a different process. Different things are going on. But, picking up that first language or those first few languages, if you're learning them early, not really that much of a problem, right? Other species, if they pick up any language capabilities at all, takes a ton of effort, right? How many of you have trained your dog to roll over? Yeah, how long did that take? That's the wrong answer.
It literally took like maybe an hour.
Really? Well, that's not bad. There you go.
And you have to keep reinforcing.
You do.
Yeah.
You don't really have to do that with people, right? And it's just like, oh, I learned what roll over means. Well, you know that one forever. You're not, it's just there, right? Some things you have to really think about. So we have brains that have evolved for communication, right? That's not to say that other species don't communicate. They do. Elephants, they have this awesome way to send like what they call infrasound, right? So they can send these like super low-pitched noises over vast distances, like through the ground. It's actually really impressive. It's pretty cool, right? Rats will do the same thing, like rat pups. They have these infrasound squeals that go out, which is kind of interesting.
Orcas have like very specialized language depending on where they're located at. So
Yeah.
So they have different types of language.
They do. Yeah, it's kind of cool. Dolphins actually have names for themselves, which is kind of interesting. They don't know other people's name, other dolphins' names. But what they'll do is, like, let's say this dolphin's name's Chuck, and Chuck's just barreling down at you. Chuck just yells, "Chuck!" like the whole time he's swimming. And then, whatever the other dolphin is coming through, I don't know what good dolphin names are. He's just yelling his name back at that dolphin. They don't yell each other's names. Like, it's not to say they don't recognize each other, but it's sort of like their own theme music, right? Like, I'm coming through the door, so I'm going to play this song. I'm just going to yell out my name. It's actually kind of fascinating. I don't know if you guys thought that was as cool as I did. So you should start doing that, just running around on campus screaming your name, right? So that other people know it's you. I would be interested in seeing that. We should do that as a class activity. Oh no.
Why not? That would be so fun.
We'll see. So, we already talked about lateralization of function. Not a big deal. Left hemisphere, keep that in mind. We should talk about something called the mental lexicon, right? How many of you know the meanings of words? Yeah, great job. Those of you that didn't raise your hand, we don't know, right? Because maybe you didn't understand what I said. You didn't know the meaning of those words. So that's a problem. So you have to access this thing called the mental lexicon. It's a dictionary in your brain. You're going to access that sort of toward the back. Wernicke's area is going to be very, very important in that. Wernicke's area is going to help you access that. If you damage Wernicke's area or some of those surrounding structures, as we'll talk about in a moment, you're going to have some difficulty comprehending that speech. How many of you speak more than one language? Anybody? I know, yeah, okay, great. So, bilingual. English is one of those. I don't know the other one. Persian? All right. So, what's really interesting about this is if you're bilingual, some of the areas that you use for both languages are going to be the same, right? There's going to be some overlap in those areas. But some of the areas are going to be separate as well, right? So you're going to have some brain regions that are only for English and some that are only for Persian, right? And so that's going to be kind of interesting. So what you could see, and now please don't, because I know somebody's going to ask about that kid that got hit in the head with a soccer ball and like woke up and could speak Spanish even though he'd never, spoken Spanish at all. That doesn't happen. So I'm just going to tell you that one. However, let's imagine he could speak Spanish and English and then got hit in the head with a soccer ball. It is feasible that he could lose some capabilities in one or the other language and not both, right? Because again, we have those, if you're bilingual, you can have separate brain regions for parts, and then there is going to be some overlap as well. So you could have some specific language deficits in one language, but maybe not in the other, depending on the extent of the brain damage. I don't know about that. That seems like a good opportunity to trick people. I don't know. I'm going to try that next time I don't know. I'm going to have to plan a surgery to get an organ removed or something. Start walking around with a Scottish accent. I don't know. Give that a try. I don't know. I've not really looked into that too much. That's kind of interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Anybody else know anything about that? Have you ever been anesthetized and you woke up with an accent? No, that's never happened to anybody. We could try it. That's what we'll do. Casey, the week before the final, I'll bring in some anesthetics, and then we'll see how many of you wake up with an accent. I mean, different than the one you have, right? There's like some assumption that all of you have some sort of accent, right?
I feel like there's some in here that would be like, hell yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I do too. And then I'd have to like refer those people to the dean's office.
Or the fourth floor.
Or the fourth floor. Oh, the fourth floor's got a waiting list. The dean's not that
Yeah,
popular.
go there.
Yeah, nobody go back to the clinic. There's a waiting list. Is that better? Nobody listens to me anyway. I mean, it doesn't matter.
You were the one that provided the waiting list with all your referrals.
Probably not from this class.
Yeah, okay, probably not.
It's probably from that Wednesday class. All right. So there you go. That's kind of interesting. You also, if you're bilingual, you have an increased sort of density in your left parietal cortex. Now, what we're going to see in a moment is the parietal cortex is that location back in the back there for Wernicke's area and where it's going to access that mental lexicon. Makes perfect sense, right? If you speak 2 languages, how much bigger is your mental lexicon than someone who speaks 1 language? That's probably almost twice as big, right? Because you probably need 2 words for everything, right? It may not be exactly 2 words, probably like 1.75 times as big. Because I'm assuming in your native language, you're probably a bit better, right? If you've picked up a second language later in life, you probably don't have the full command of that as if you were a native speaker, for the most part. So we'll say it's 1.75 times bigger for your mental lexicon. It's a guess. Questions about that? That's kind of interesting.
Is that what's affected when you just like say you move somewhere and you pick up an accent? Is that affected?
I don't know. Does that happen to you?
Yeah, I've heard like if you move, people pick up like an accent where they're from.
Wow, that's interesting.
Accent around there.
I spent a week in Ireland, and like the culture of the West Virginians, like that meant that some of our words we had like a slight accent in our vowels and everything. So I can see that.
So actually, Cameron, that's an interesting sort of line of it's not, thankfully. I mean, people would look at you strangely, right, if you did, and so that's the reason I think. There's actually that's actually sort of an interesting question or comment, and I'll tell you about something else because I'm sure you're interested in vocal cords now as well. So this is gonna get exciting. So why it's interesting that might have been an easy thing. Like some accents are going to be easier for some people to pick up than others, right? And there are different reasons why that might be. There are some ideas in particular about like this region of the country, right? And by this region, I mean that kind of like angular slash that goes through that's like this wide on the map, right? Where there aren't like a lot of big cities, called Appalachia. I don't know if you guys have ever been there. It's a joke. I'm sure you have. So, there's actually some interesting idea about that because if you start to think about a number of if you were start to think about an Appalachian accent, right, to some degree, it would very closely mimic an accent of the sort of like the Highlands, right, on the British Isles, which is where a vast number of the Europeans who came over to this area were from, and so that they sort of brought that language with them. Accents and language is actually sort of a very interesting sort of topic, right? And so if you were to think about some of the pronunciations, there are going to be subtle differences, right? So that's actually a really interesting kind of thing that might have happened to you. Had you taken a bunch of people from Wisconsin, that might have been a harder transition, right? But taking West Virginians, it might be an easy thing to do. I don't know, anybody find that interesting? I sort of did. I don't know why. There's also this story I heard once about this guy who studied accents, and he started studying the Philadelphian accent. I don't know if anybody's been to Philadelphia. Apparently they have their own accent there. I thought they only had cheesesteaks, but apparently they have an accent as well in Philadelphia. Well, whatever. So, but he actually had like 50 or 60 years worth of recordings of interviews from local, like lifelong residents of Philadelphia, and he was able to track the changes in the accent over the decades, which was actually kind of interesting. It was like changes in the length of the vowel sounds, which is sort of fascinating. I thought I had another accent story, but I think that's it. That's okay. Vocal cords. I do want to tell you about vocal cords, right? How many of you speak a language from Southeast Asia? Anybody? Nobody? That's great. Anybody know someone from Southeast Asia? Yeah, right? Zach knows one person. Great. One person? I don't know. A lot of Asian languages are what we call tonal languages, right? So I don't know if you guys are aware of this, which is kind of interesting. They're tonal, and what we mean by that is there's like one word, and depending on how you say that word, the pitch that you use, I'm not even going to try to mimic it because it's going to be impossible. The way you say that, the 5 different pitches, they have 5 different meanings, right? And I know you're thinking like, well, isn't that the same as a homonym? And it's not. right? So if you think about what's a good homonym, to, for example, right? I'm going to the store. I would like to buy some bananas too, right? Those are sort of similar, but whatever, they're different. You don't really have to, the pitch doesn't matter, right? I'm going to the store, it means the same as going to the store, right? It doesn't matter. But if you're speaking Chinese, for example, and you were to say a word in a different pitch, it can carry 5 different meanings, or up to 5 meanings. They're tonal languages. What's really interesting about that, I don't know if any of you have ever been to sort of like Southeast Asia. I never have, and probably won't, for this same reason. It's humid, right? And so when things are humid, guess what they can do? They can stretch a little bit, right? Okay, and they have a little extra stretch there. Now let's contrast that with somewhere like Poland, right? I don't know if anybody's ever been to Poland. I don't like, when I'm listing like humid countries, Poland doesn't make the list, right? At all. So there's like some bottom end country, and then there's like a gap, and then you start making like some of those European countries, right? So if you think about European languages, they're not tonal, right? They're not tonal at all. Doesn't matter what, how you sort of say the word, the tone, it's going to have the same meaning, right? Might carry some emotional content that's different. That's a whole different story. And the reason for that, though, is if you start examining the vocal cords of individuals, right, of Asian individuals versus European individuals, what you'll find is that Asian vocal cords are stretchier, right? And so they actually have that capability to produce those different tones more easily. European vocal cords are kind of, they get stuck together. And so that tonal language didn't really develop in European areas, and that was, again, largely because of the humidity. Anybody know why you get a good scratchy throat in the winter? It's drier, right? So it's so that kind of happens. Over time, people start to evolve. People who are really great at language, believe it or not, are going to be more successful at making more people who are really great at language than people who are not, right? And so I think if you were to list like what are the top characteristics you're looking for in a partner, one of the things that you're probably looking for that's not going to be on your list because you take it for granted is a good communicator, right? And I don't mean like in the sense like, oh, I can definitely like pour out my feelings in some passionate way that really does something for you on some level. I don't know, but to be able to tell you like, hey, I'm going to work, I'm going to be back in like 10 hours, like that's kind of an important thing, right? If somebody just kind of goes and out the door, you don't know what's happening, right? And so you need to be able to communicate with that person. So over the time, when somebody was not a good communicator, guess what happened to them? They like ran off a cliff. Somebody said, hey, watch out, and they didn't get that message. So over time, we've evolved as really great communicators. If you evolved or sort of developed in an area where you had the ability to have stretchier vocal cords, then over time people are going to have stretchier vocal cords because those individuals are going to have a better command of their language, right? So they're going to have more offspring. So there you go. That's probably more than you wanted to know about vocal cords and languages, right? It's kind of fascinating. So don't get discouraged if you have difficulty learning a language. Also, pick a language as close to your own if you want to get an A. Right? So that's my suggestion for you. There you go. Questions about that? Don't major in liberal arts. We're the only people that make you take four foreign language classes. Huh? Yeah. Yeah, I know. I think that's kind of stupid. How many of you took those 4 foreign language classes? How many of you are fluent in that language? There you go. How many of you have any better understanding of that culture than if you had just... Okay, that's the wrong answer. But you could have achieved that in a different way that was less painful, right? Yes. Yes.
I'm very upset. I had to take first.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I tell people all the time, pick a major in a different college. Just go somewhere else. I don't want to deal with you. True story, Casey. I tried talking someone out of being a psych major last week. It didn't work. She was like, no, I'm going to do it anyway. I was like, don't say I didn't warn you. Yeah. What are you going to do? All right, anybody have any questions? Vocal cords, accents, we talked a little about that. That was sort of interesting. Anybody try a variety of accents, like when you're driving home? Nobody's in the car. Then I worry sometimes, like, so here's the main reason I don't do accents, right? No, the main reason is I don't think I could. The second reason is I think maybe somebody's not, like where's the line? I don't know where the line is, so I just avoid it, right? So if I don't know where a line is, Casey, I just stay away from it. I don't know where the line is between, like, I'm doing an accent and I'm, like, actually just making fun of someone. Because I saw that movie Breakfast at Tiffany's, and I thought, man, I don't want to go down that road. And so if you've not seen it, part of me wants to say it's a good movie and you should watch it, and part of me wants to say, hey, watch out for the racism, because that's in there. But there you go. I'm not going to give you a recommendation one way or the other, but there's some serious problems there. Anybody a Peter Dinklage fan? Somebody's going to raise their hand, Casey. It's like a big scandal about that recently, right? Well, he was in that new movie about the guy from Love Boat, right? There's like some problems. Anyway, long story. Don't worry about it. Oh, hey, how many of you recognize other people's voices? Yeah. Right, Andre, great job. The rest of you, I assume, can too. If you can't, you've actually had some brain damage. So that's why I'm going to assume most of you can. If you have some damage in your right hemisphere, there's phonoagnosia. Agnosia just means you're unable to recognize something. We'll talk about some of that stuff later. The point is, with phonoagnosia, you have difficulty recognizing people's voices. Right? Somebody answers the phone. I mean, now we all have caller ID, right? So you know who's calling. But sometimes you get surprised, right? Like somebody else answers the phone. Has that ever happened to you? You call somebody like, what are you doing? I mean, most of the time it's like I'm just like calling my mom and my dad answers. I'm like, okay, well that makes sense. But sometimes there can be some weird ones. So you recognize people's voices. You hear them talking to you. You know who they are. It's pretty helpful. All right, so here's that mental lexicon. Back here, this red splotch is Wernicke's area, right? We have this nice region going around it called the posterior language area, okay? This is the guy that helps you access your memories of words, the perceptions that you're having, so you can access that mental lexicon and get that information into Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area says, okay, I understand what's being said. This is that area, Kyle, that's going to be a little thicker for you, a little denser, right? Because you've got that second language there. Okay. You've got to be able to access that. If you have damage to these areas, this posterior language area, damage to Wernicke's area, you're going to have difficulty understanding speech. Okay? People are going to say things to you, and you're going to, who knows what you'll do, because you don't know what they're saying. Okay, you may do some random thing that's unrelated because you think that's what they said. We don't know. There's no real way to figure out. The reason for this is, if you ask somebody with Wernicke's aphasia, hey, what's it like to have Wernicke's aphasia? Well, they didn't understand what you said. So how are they going to answer you? They're not. What's interesting, though, about folks with Wernicke's aphasia, they actually have very fluent speech. It doesn't make any sense, right? It follows rules, syntax, right? So it has kind of like verb-noun business, right? So they might say things like, the chair ate a pickle. All right, well, I mean, if you were going to write that sentence and diagram it for your, English class or whatever, makes perfect sense, right? You got nouns, you got verbs, you got articles, you got things in the right order, put a period at the end, that's fine. It doesn't make any sense to say really the chair ate a pickle, right? I mean, it's just, it's not something that makes a lot of sense from a logical standpoint. They're able to get these words out. Words flow out of them all the time. They can say things, not a problem. If you want to contrast that with Broca's aphasia, so we have Broca's aphasia, damage to this area. Broca's aphasia is different. Folks with Broca's aphasia understand what you're telling them. You can say, hey, what's it like to have Broca's aphasia? They can tell you 25 minutes later, because it takes a long time for for them to get words out. They can't get all of their words out smoothly. Okay, so there are two types of words, Haley, that we want to think about. One is what we call a content word, and the other is a function word, right? A content word is like a noun and a verb, right? If I'm going to tell you a story about a dog jumping over a log and then running to chase a bird, and then some kid finds it, right? Dog, jump, bird. These are content words, right? So if you, I don't know, I kind of think about, these guys don't know Lassie, do they? Probably not, right?
The dog that helped, right?
It's the dog that helped, yeah. Yeah, you know, so like Lassie would come up and always bark, and then, you know, somebody would always say like, oh, you know, kid in a well, okay. You know, and you just try to get the message, but there's not a lot of content words. There aren't nouns, there aren't there aren't articles and things. You know, if you say, the dog jumped over the log, well, the over the log, I mean, there are certain words in there that don't really add to the story, right? The words that add to the story, dog, jump, log. That's all you need, right? If I tell you dog, jump, log, you know what happened, right, Andre? You know a dog jumped over a log. It's that simple, okay? So those are the content words. People with Broca's aphasia can get those words out. It's difficult. It's a very labored speech, right? It takes them some time to get it out, but they can do it. And that shows you they understand what you're saying. I mean, you can even ask them to do things, and then if you say, hey, go over and move the chair, well, they'll walk over and they'll move the chair, right? Because they know, they can comprehend what you're saying. They just can't tell you, I went over and moved the chair. They might say, move chair. And you go, okay, well, you got it, right? I mean, I got the story. I know what's going on. They just have trouble getting that out. That's completely different than Wernicke's aphasia, where these people are just, you know, throwing words out at you. Sounds beautiful, nice and smooth, but what they're saying is not connected to reality at all. Doesn't make any sense.
Does that have anything to do with Tourette's?
Yeah, so Tourette's is going to be different. It's going to involve different brain regions. Tourette's is really a basal ganglia issue, right? Because it's a motor. With Tourette's, we're thinking about a motor issue rather than, you know, some kind of language. We typically think about Tourette's, you know, people just like randomly screaming out, you know, expletives or something, right? But most of the time, Tourette's is really just facial tics, just other, you know, sort of motor tics. It doesn't, I mean, not as often does it get to some sort of, you know, vocalization, right? We'll talk about Tourette's in a couple weeks, though, when we talk about the basal ganglia. That's a good question. It's an even better answer, wasn't it, Casey? Perfect. It was a perfect answer. Yeah. Almost like I'd had that question before. No. Actually, I'm not sure I had. So, we've got Broca's aphasia, we've got Wernicke's aphasia, right? That's kind of exciting. Okay. Questions about that? Comments, concerns? Awesome. Hey, who loves metaphors? Yeah. Everybody loves, nobody loves metaphors, right? Metaphors are to blank as scissors are to, what? Oh, that's an analogy, isn't it? Yeah, whatever. They work the same. Nobody likes those either. So metaphors, right? How many of you had to take some composition classes? Probably talked about metaphors in there, right? Speaking metaphorically. What's interesting about this is actually happening in your right hemisphere, right? Again, we said there are some exceptions to that left hemisphere business. In this case, metaphors are going to be in the right hemisphere, right? We've got to think about some interesting relationships with metaphors, right? And so there's a little more to it than just straight language accessing the meaning of those words, right? We have to apply that meaning in some context. So we're going to use a little bit of the right hemisphere as well. Hey, there's a guy's brain. I know, I probably should have said, hey, who's eating right now? And then, so anyway, how many of you have ever had your brain case opened up? Nobody? That's exciting. Occasionally they have to go in and they have to do some brain surgery on folks, right? So that happens. This is an individual who spoke English and French. Okay. French was his native language. and then he started learning English when he was a little bit older. Now, if you ever have brain surgery, they won't anesthetize you. And the reason for that is, remember that time I said in your brain a millimeter is the difference between life and death? Right? So they'll keep you awake, and then they'll start like poking around. Like, hey, what happens there when your arm moves? You're like, oh, well, let me try that again. And so they'll just kind of feel around. They don't want to cut out too much brain tissue, but they want to take enough to solve your problem. If they're rerouting blood vessels, whatever they're doing, they don't want to put you asleep. They'll anesthetize your head, right? Some local anesthetic. You know, so when they're like sawing away your skull, you know, that doesn't hurt too much. Sure, it hurts a little. I don't know. But they're not gonna. You're not gonna have a general anesthetic. On top of that, your brain doesn't have pain sensors, so once they get your skull removed, there's no pain at all. I promise you. Casey, did I ever tell you I have a video of my uncle getting a cerebral bypass? No, he didn't have it because he had a problem. I kept it because it was cool. Yeah, he offered it to me. I was like, I'll take it. He had to go in for like triple bypass surgery on his heart, and then while he was in there, he had a stroke because he never took his blood pressure medicine. He had a calcium deposit blocked part of his. I know, right? And so now he can't do math. He still. I know. It's kind of funny. He has some math problems, but he still drives, which is a little frightening. But he goes so it's my mom's brother, right? So they go out, and so like she has to calculate the tip for him because he doesn't know how much. It's like, I have no idea. It's like gives people money and it's like, just take whatever is the right amount. So anyway, this guy was bilingual. They would ask him questions or to name things in English, and like that part of his brain got excited when he did them in French. Notice two regions, Kyle. There you go, right? So you've got one or the other. Now, had he learned French or in English at the same time, like from birth, you might see a different story, right? But where he learned English a bit later, so we only sort of have it in that region. And that's at age 11, right? And that's not too late of a start to learn a language there. And just to give you an idea where you're located, they put the brain here. It's kind of upside down, right? So it's kind of like the bottom part of his left hemisphere, like right over here. Oh, this is interesting. Am I allowed to make Seinfeld jokes? You sure? Sometimes I avoid those. Anybody watch Seinfeld? A couple people. Remember These Pretzels Are Making Me Thirsty episode, right? That's like, I should find that clip on YouTube maybe and show it sometime. So there's an episode where one of the characters, his name's Kramer, he got a part in a Woody Allen movie. I'm sorry. Oh, I did? Yeah, you guys didn't watch it? Well, that's too bad. But the point is, he has to say this line, and he says it different ways. And every time he says it, it has some different emotional content to it, right? And so when we're thinking about normal speech, getting your left hemisphere excited, versus speech with some emotional content, it'll get your right hemisphere involved in it as well. Because again, it's another sort of exception to that left hemisphere only story, right? Or one hemisphere only story for you, Celine, because it's flipped. So when there's emotional content, it's going to go in the right hemisphere is going to get involved. You can think about when somebody says something sarcastically, right? And you think, oh, well, they didn't really mean that. Your right hemisphere is going to get involved with that processing. Does that make sense to everybody? Great, thanks for the response. Testing out your right hemispheres there. Oh, hey, we already talked about Broca's aphasia. That's awesome. Slow, laborious, non-fluent speech. Much better comprehension than production, right? And in general, during development, comprehension outpaces production, right? I mean, you can't understand what kids say until they're probably, 15, 16 years old. Up until then, it's all just gibberish. It's all about Transformers or My Little Ponies or something. I don't know. Are those still things kids play with? You think so? That's what I know. Somebody could add that. So kids, you can tell them things and they can do them, but they can't always communicate with you in return, right? So again, comprehension typically outpaces production. Folks with Broca's aphasia, they have difficulty with those function words we talked about, those grammar words, right? Trying to connect words together. But they do okay with nouns, verbs, adjectives, right? They could say red dog jump, right? So you guys got that? Okay, we know what's happening. The red dog jumped. It's great. So there you go. What's really cool about this is because they have what's called a grammatism, right? So they have difficulty using those sort of grammatical elements. We know that then Broca's area is going to be important for grammar, right? So that's something. Maybe you guys could take like a Broca's area specific stimulant when you take your English class, right? Get that grammar keyed up. You guys are going to go take the GRE or something. You're like, oh man, I'm not doing so well on the qualitative section. Better pop one of these. What are we going to call them, Adriana? I mean, we got the airbag for the brain. What are we going to call that? It's going to ramp up your Broca's area. Get your little Broca's buzz going on. I don't know.
I like the alliteration.
It is, right there you go. So you get that Broca's area keyed up a little bit, and you maybe do a little better at your grammar. I don't know. Does that seem to make sense to people? Also, they'll have something called anomia, which is sort of a word-finding difficulty. Most people have experienced this, right? How many of you have ever tried to find a word and you can't? You're like, oh man, I need to open the, what's that thing called? Door. Yeah, got to open the door so I can leave. So we've all had some instance of this. I mean, so don't freak out if you're like, oh man, I can't think of this word. It's probably not a big deal. If that's happening like every time you're trying to tell someone something, it's probably something you should get checked out. But if it's just like one time you forgot, you know, what the pickle jar was or something like, you know, it's in that thing there with the juice, it's salty, pickle jar, and that's it. Then you're probably okay. It gets worse as you get older, Casey said. I didn't want to bring you guys that far down.
I will.
But she's just doom and gloom up here. Yeah. Now it gets what? What as you get older? I can't remember the word. It gets worse. Is there anything that gets better as you get older? No. No. Getting some hard no's from a couple sectors out there. Maybe your bank account. Licorice. Licorice gets better as you get older. I'm actually kind of a fan of licorice. Yeah. And the other thing I eat that other people go, they make the same face, whorehound candy. I eat whorehound candy all the time if I get my hands on it. That's the best stuff ever. That and Fisherman's Friend. Those will clear you out. I don't care what's wrong with you. You got a broken leg, rub a Fisherman's Friend on it. And it's guaranteed to fix it. It'll scare the break right out of it. For those of you that have not had a Fisherman's Friend, it only smells slightly better than a fish. It's pretty strong, but they are good, and they'll definitely, and they're nice and flat. You just kind of gotta watch them. You should try one of those the next time you race. Early morning race, you put in a Fisherman's Friend, shave a minute. Doesn't matter what the distance is. 40-yard dash, it'll shave a minute off your time. You'll finish before you start because you need something to drink. They are good, I promise you. So there you go. So word finding difficulty, not a big deal. You do have what we call articulation difficulties. Now this is where we talk about that aphasia versus what might be an apraxia. If we're talking about apraxia, that's actually a motor issue, right? With Broca's aphasia, we don't have any motor issues at all. Your mouth moves fine. You just can't produce the words. Hey, this is a beautiful drawing. How many of you have ever been in one of these situations? This is that babysitter, and here's what she's doing, Zane. She's using that screen I developed to wash dishes and check her email at the same time. So this is the end result. So if I were to ask you guys, like, hey, tell me what's going on here, it would say like, oh, well, somebody's mom's distracted. I don't know what she's looking at the ceiling there. It doesn't really matter. The sink's flooding. Little boy's trying to steal some cookies for his sister, but he's about to fall off of that stool, right? And so there you go. It's a good story. If you ask somebody with Broca's aphasia, They might go stool, fall, sink, flood. You know, they're just going to throw out a few words at you. They're not going to give you the whole sort of coherent story. But you know what's going on, right? Somebody says boy fall, you're like, well, there's some boy's falling somewhere. I'll figure out what's going on. And Lassie's going to come running in, and it's going to be fine. So you guys have to go home and watch Lassie. I don't know. Is that something I can tell people to watch? Okay. It is. See, I don't know. I worry about that. There was this string like a few months ago where I was afraid to tell people, man, I like that guy. I was like, oh, I can't do that anymore. So I was like, hold on a minute. I have to check the news to see if I can still tell you, like, I think that guy's okay. Even Charlie Rose, that one hurt me. That one hurt me, guys. I mean, Ben Affleck, we all knew, right? Kevin Spacey's been a weirdo since day one. No shocks. But Charlie Rose, man, PBS, if you're a PBS news host, I expect more out of you. And that one really hurt me. Although I thought about auditioning for a PBS news show. You know, well, he's not going to work here anymore. Yeah. It happens. What are you going to do? All right, so there's the kitchen test, whatever. All right, so language. Here's your left hemisphere again. Look at how we're getting in that, what we call the insular cortex. Why do we call it insular cortex? It's insulated, right? So it's kind of in there. So it's nice and tucked in. Lots of language processing going on there for you in that temporal cortex area. Again, we've got Broca's area right here. We've got Wernicke's area sort of here in the back. That posterior language area circling around Wernicke's, accessing all of those word meanings that you have out there in your mental lexicon, sending that information to Broca's area, right? So that Broca's area can send those motor commands out smoothly, can modulate those commands so we can have nice, fluent speech that actually indicates that we've comprehended the situation, right? All right, there's Wernicke's aphasia, difficulty with spoken word recognition, difficulty converting those thoughts into words. Again, when these people speak, whatever they say doesn't seem to be related to reality or what you've said to them, right? So there's no sort of return on that. Don't worry about this too much. Just showing you that there are different parts of your temporal cortex, of your auditory cortex, that are processing not just speech sounds. What's a speech sound? Anybody know? Like ba, da. That's one that doesn't carry very well, right? Try to make the TH sound. Nobody's going to hear that. So those are, we call those phonemes, right? That's kind of the standard word for those little short bits of speech. Typically think about those as the smallest bits. You know, for you, that's going to be all you need to know. You string a bunch of phonemes together, and then you get these words, right? So that's kind of the next step up. Put some words together, you get some thoughts. That's awesome. There are some phonemes that are not used in certain languages, right? So this is Casey where I don't know where that line is, but time to tell a story. Anyway, so we often think about like L's and R's, folks who have continued to, have had an Asian language as their first language and tried to learn English much later in life. They have a lot of difficulty with L's and R's. People who learn both of those languages early, doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter your sort of, genetic heritage on that, right? It's really the language you're hearing and whether or not you practice and repeat those phonemes, right? So you could take someone who was born, in Ireland if you want, and then drop them off somewhere in Japan, and they'll grow up speaking Japanese. You drop somebody, in Ireland from Japan, and they'll grow up speaking Irish. I think it's English there. Maybe Gaelic. Yeah, so they might speak Gaelic. There's some other languages in the British Isles. In case you guys didn't know that, right? Then you get Welsh down there as well, so you have to worry about that. Anyway, so it's related to phonemes. Kind of created a funny story once. I was working in a lab with a guy from Japan, and he kept telling me I needed to make a frog. And this was not an amphibian lab, so I was like, Akihiro, believe me, I'm good. I really am. But I don't think I can make a frog. I was like, you know, I mean, I really have a lot of confidence in my skill set, but just making a frog out of thin air is going to be more than I can pull off. It's like, no, John, you got to make a frog. I'm like, yeah, I know that's what you've said. It's not a possibility. And so about 5 minutes later, he goes and makes the frog, which in fact was a flag, because we were filming some animals as they were doing some behavioral tasks. He's like, you know, I have to write on there like the date and the experiment and you know the time, and that was a flag I had to make, not a frog at all. So we had a little trouble there, but we figured it out. I was able to put together a salamander, Zane, but it's those legs on the frog. You know, there's a lot of springiness in there. It's really baffled me. Hey, who remembers mirror neurons? Yeah. All right. These guys are involved in speech as well, right? So when you say something, when you say it to yourself, how many of you have ever said something to yourself silently, right? You might be saying something now. When's this class going to be over? It's already too long. Not just today, but the whole semester. But also when you hear those syllables, right? Some of those same brain regions will get excited. So the mirror neuron system is going to be involved in that as well. This goes back to that idea about how easy it is for us to learn language, right? If we've got a mirror neuron system involved, this is why it's easy for us to learn how to walk, right? You think it's hard to learn how to walk, but really it's not about learning, it's just about getting the leg strength and development to do that, right? I mean, you know, as soon as you are able to like stand up, and you're just like, you know, take off walking, right? Yeah. Who knows? Because again, we can't really ask them what they hear because they're congenitally deaf, right? I think people who lose their hearing later obviously can still hear like an internal monologue. I would assume. I don't know. That's a puzzler. I don't know if there's any way to, because I don't know how they would tell you if, you know, because they have no concept of hear, right? Which is kind of interesting. I will say people who learn sign language, I should have told you this before, they can get Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia. So if they communicate exclusively through sign language, they have damage to Broca's aphasia. Their signing becomes slow and labored, and they're only able to get out those content words. Same thing if they have damage to Wernicke's area. They can sign all day long, but none of it makes any sense, right? It follows the rules, but it doesn't make sense logically. So, sign language is a language the same as spoken language and uses the same brain regions to process that meaning and the content. But I don't know if someone born deaf, what they would hear, because we all do kind of have that internal monologue, right? And you guys are just running away with that. That's an interesting question. I hadn't really considered that before. All right, so we already talked about Wernicke's aphasia, and there's this idea of transcortical sensory aphasia. Don't worry about that too much. Just know if you get damage in between the Wernicke's and Broca's area, that you're going to have difficulty with language. In particular, you would be able to repeat words, but you're not going to be able to understand them, right? So because some of that connection is still going to be intact, even though you've had damage other places, you can repeat words back to someone, but you're not going to be able to, you know, you can say banana, and then you might just, you know, pick up a cup of coffee, right? You can repeat words, but no understanding of the meanings. All right. All right, don't worry, that's what we just talked about here. We've just talked about aphasia in folks who are deaf. So we talked about that. There are your mirror neurons. Rhyming. I'm not going to ask you much about rhyming. How many of you love to rhyme? No one loves rhyming at all? That's fine. I should do that on the test. I should ask you a question about rhyming, but you have to answer it in rhyme. I don't know if anybody would find that interesting. I would. Huh? Extra credit if you write your exam in if you write your exam in rhyme, I'll give you extra credit. Huh? Something to consider. We should talk about stuttering, though, right? Several people probably know someone who stutters, or maybe struggled with stuttering yourself, right? So this is a fairly common situation, not too big of a deal. Typically, we have frequent pauses, or sort of sounds are going to be prolonged a little bit, right? When folks stutter, you kind of have those repetitions, right, of sounds and syllables. I think recently, I don't know, anybody see The King's Speech? That's a little bit of an older movie now, right? It's a good movie, though, right? I mean, it's Colin Firth. I can't mention Jeffrey Rush. He's on the list. Man. Cindy, this is it's tough. It's tough, right? Life would be easier if people just kept their hands to themselves. That's like a lesson my mom taught me when I was a kid, right? She said, you have pockets on your pants for a reason. Put your hands in there and keep walking. And that's what I do. And it's so easy. Right? You would think so. I don't know. So there's this movie, The King's Speech. You guys know this movie? You guys know Colin Firth, right? I mean, you know, that's going to get some hands, right? Did you guys watch that 12-hour-long Pride and Prejudice miniseries? A number of you did because you laughed. That's how I know. I've seen it 3 times. It's my wife's favorite book. Yeah. I say I've seen it 3 times. I've slept through it 2.5 times. It's like, geez. And what are these people even saying? And it's like, I understand the words, but I don't know what they're talking about. The only guy I like is the Reverend. He's hilarious. Yeah, I've seen him in other things too recently. He's still hilarious. So, if you haven't seen that one, don't. But The King's Speech, you should watch that. That's a good movie, right? Everybody loves Helena Bonham Carter. She's in that movie, right? Yeah, I thought so. She does play his wife, yeah. So it's about, this guy was a king of England, and he gave a speech, right, during World War II. That's kind of the important part. He had difficulty speaking. He stuttered a lot, right? And so he had a speech coach who helped him with that and delivered this really kind of passionate speech over the radio at some point that kind of rallied folks and, you know, kind of defeated fascism. That was kind of a good thing. That one time we did it. That one time we did it, it worked out okay. You never know, right? Hang in there. Stuttering. What causes stuttering? Why do people stutter? What can you do to fix it? Now, there are all kinds of sort of therapeutic interventions, right, that folks will go through. Different training, speech therapy. Anybody in communications disorders? Sometimes I get a few folks who are in the communications disorders department, right? And they have some interesting things sometimes. So, what's really interesting about this, and they use these sort of diffusion tensor imaging studies to do this, if you look at folks who stutter, they have a decreased amount of white matter just under what's called the ventral premotor cortex, right? So it's kind of like just under that cortex, right? So they have a decreased white matter. If you start to do therapy for folks with stuttering, what you see is that white matter starts to expand, right? So those axons start to get thicker, right? So that myelin sheath kind of picks up. What's interesting about this is sort of the part of your brain that's involved in monitoring feedback from your own voice, right? How many of you have ever heard yourself speak? Well, like every time you open your mouth, that's what happens. And you don't always think about it, right? But let's say you want to make a statement, and that statement is, I would like a pepperoni pizza. Please pick a pepperoni pizza, right? So we can stick with that alliteration for those of you that are excited about that. Now, if you're trying to say that sentence, or whatever sentence you want to say, it doesn't really matter. You get halfway through that, and for some reason, you're not able to recognize that you've said that word. What are you going to do? You just repeat it, right? And you'll continue to repeat it up until the point that that signal gets through, and you can move on to the rest of the sentence, right? So that's why folks who stutter, they'll get stuck at a particular point up until the time that they receive that feedback that says, okay, I've said that word. I've said pepperoni. Let's move on. Let's say pizza now. They just don't get that feedback. So it's kind of interesting, actually. And I think it's really interesting that you can affect that white matter by by these different therapeutic interventions, which is kind of exciting.
How is it you can have somebody that's stutters when they speak, but they can
Yeah, Meltilus is great, right? What do most singers have? So you got a guy in the front, and what do you have behind that guy? You got a backup singer, right? So same thing. People who stutter, they can recite things with other folks. They don't have any problems with that. Cindy, they're getting that feedback, right? That feedback is getting through in that situation rather than in a normal sort of individual speaking situation. They're not. That's a great question. I don't know why anybody else didn't ask about Meltilus.
and they're still sitting there asking me about colors.
Yeah, how many of you are Googling Meltilus at this point? Zach, do you have a question? Did you want to know who Meltilus is?
Not doing it, but my question was like more based on relation to that. As high school as science teacher told us in response to a very similar question that it was because for music you use the right side of your brain, for standard communication you use the left side of your brain. Kind of has to do with that. Is that true at all?
You know, I hadn't really considered any sort of right hemisphere interventions there. That is a possibility. I don't know that that's going to make a change in the feedback you're receiving. But yeah, no, that's actually sort of an interesting idea. Something to look into. You could write a paper about that in rhyme. And then we could name that brain region after Meltilus. Did you guys look up, Andre, did you look up Meltilus? He's a musician, and when he would speak, he had a considerable stutter. Yeah, it was very pronounced. It was very difficult for him to speak. But when he would sing, now I'm not going to put any sort of quality judgment on his singing, but he did not stutter, right? So I will say that. I'm not going to say like he was a beautiful singer and he's like world renowned. He was very famous and very well known in his time, and had considerable success as a musician. And if that's your style, then you probably know who he is. If not, it would just be like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like an equivalent today, right? Like if Bruno Mars stuttered when he talked, but not when he was singing. Yeah, there we go, right? I got some head nods there. You guys, it's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense, right? Yeah, okay. I was going to try to pick some other people, and then I thought, well, that's not really quite the same. I have to think about somebody that actually like sings and doesn't just talk while there's music playing, right? Which is like a different process. Does that make sense? Because I had a couple people jump in mind pretty quickly, and I was like, well, that's not really the same. Because I'm starting to think now, right? This is what I want to check, right? Is there like a person who, if you think about like music styles, right, where people don't really sing, but they more just like talk in some rhythmic fashion, right? Is that going to be, I don't know, right? I'm thinking about this. Like would those individuals stutter then as well, or not? Do you know what I'm saying? I don't know. You guys should look into it. Nobody's going to do that. But I'm thinking about it. Like seriously, I'm seriously thinking about it. Like what if Chance the Rapper had a stutter? Is he going to stutter while he's performing or not? I don't know, right? That's a good question, right, Zach? I mean, that's...
In that discussion,
was Chance the Rapper involved?
A kid who had a stutter really bad, but he rapped.
Really?
That goes.
Well, maybe it's okay then. I don't know. Maybe, was he wearing an earpiece? Maybe somebody's saying the words into his ear, so he's getting the feedback. That's a good bypass. Nah, I don't know. Whatever. It was an interesting discussion for a moment. Made you guys think about it. Now I'm just thinking about Kit Kats for some reason. I'm thinking about that Chance the Rapper commercial where he had with the Kit Kats. so that's where my mind was going. I'm a little hungry, to be honest. I don't know. Anybody anybody have? You guys probably are full of Kit Kats, right? Because I know you all go trick or treating, and people always give away Kit Kats. Is that true, Sarah? That's what I thought. I had a melty Snickers earlier from the psych department office. They were it was like in the wrapper. I think I ate part of the wrapper. I was like, whatever. It'll come out eventually. Or it'll block something and kill me. One of the two. It'll make a difference to your guys' lives. Here's a nice chart breaking down some of these different things. I would be prepared to talk about Wernicke's aphasia and Broca's aphasia. Some of the other things are kind of nuances. You know, have some idea about what's going on there, but definitely those two. All right. How many of you love reading and writing? None of you. How many of you do reading and writing every day? Yeah, everybody does, right? Okay, so it's pretty important. What's really interesting is that folks who have these aphasias, either Broca's or Wernicke's aphasia, their writing tends to mimic their verbal skills. So if somebody has Broca's aphasia and they try to write you a letter, it's going to be sparse. It's going to be like, I'm going to dial you guys way back, like reading a telegram, right? Nobody knows telegrams. See, back before Instagram, you know, that's where the gram comes from. It was a telegram originally, right? You had these long wires, actual wires that used to connect different locations, like on the planet. And on one end, they would send in a sequence of dots and dashes, and on the other end would come out a smiley face. No, on the other end would come out the other dots and dashes, and then someone would transcribe that into words. Now that whole process is handled in the cloud magically, right? And so when you send in the smiley emoji and it gets translated through the magic of the internet and cell signals, right? And it goes up to space for a while and then comes back down, and then maybe it always has to go to Atlanta. I don't know why. And then it comes back to you. It just comes out as a smiley face, right? But back when and those are all free, right? Most of you probably have unlimited plans, right? Right? Everybody sends text messages, just however many you want. You're not paying a nickel a word, right? They used to charge you per word for the telegram because this was a labor-intense process, right? Dot, dash, wait. Was that a pause or was that no? And it just takes forever. And then you got to write it down and you got to like carry it to someone physically. And you can see how much. This is why. Yeah, this is exactly why they didn't have binge watching in the 1800s. Because they were spending all of their time on telegrams instead of watching The Real Housewives of the Wild Frontier.
Lots of jobs.
Huh?
Lots of jobs.
Lots of jobs now?
There were jobs back then.
There were jobs. They were just like writing down dots and dashes, but you had jobs. I mean, everybody was employed. That's certain. Doing something, right? You ever wonder about that? What was the unemployment rate then? Because it just took so much effort to do everything. There you go. So, back when you used to have to send telegrams, they charged you for per word, right? And so you would send these sort of like short phrases, right? You know, like, mom's sick, buying coffin. Stop. And then you got to put the stop in there. By the way, a stop is a period, in case you guys didn't know, right? It's not like, you know, stop whatever you're doing. So, what was this? You all right, Casey?
Sorry, that really was funny.
What was funny?
Mom's dead. That got me.
Sorry. I mean, that's my brother still sends text messages like he's paying for the word, which is bad because you send him a message, you know, and you can send like a paragraph to someone in a text message these days, right? I can do that. I've done this. People have done it to me. It's like maybe a little annoying, takes a while, but you can do it. But he'll just send me like 2 words, and I'm like, then I'm gonna send him 5 more messages to figure out what he meant by those 2 words. Wrong coach. Just randomly. But he talks that way sometimes too, and he does not have Broca's aphasia. I promise you. I don't know what his problem is. Just like yell out in the middle of a Thanksgiving dinner, irrigation. It's just, so what about irrigation? Well, remember 10 minutes ago. I was like, yeah. He's like, yeah, it's irrigation. I was like, well, I know, thanks. The worst was the time he yelled out, I bet Nazis could do it. Which is not something you hear much out of people. I mean, at least then. This was a few years ago. You might hear it more now. Yeah, He was watching Mythbusters, right? And it was the show about whether or not you could sneeze with your eyes open. And then he's just all of a sudden like, I bet Nazis could do it. I was like, where's the backstory? And he's like, oh yeah, they used to they cut their eyelids off so they could still watch people while they were guarding them or whatever. I was like, okay. Well, that made some sense. It's a little weird, but thanks. But you could have prefaced that whole story with, hey, here's an interesting sort of fact, mid-20th century history, and that would have helped us all, not just yelling out, I bet Nazis can do it. It's one of my favorites. I don't know. So there you go. You can yell that down the street if you want. I wouldn't recommend it. Things you shouldn't say in public. Speaking of that, I went to Kroger once, like a year ago, and I tried not to go back. And I'm in the checkout line. I'm buying some bread. Did I tell you about this? And so I buy this bread called Dave's Killer Bread. I don't know if you've had Dave's Killer Bread. It's worth your money, right? So I don't eat or buy a lot of bread. I definitely don't buy much white bread, right? I typically go with the stuff that has seeds in it, but then I have to go floss, right? Because I get this stuff out. Anyway, Dave spent 15 years in prison. He got out, legally took over his family's bakery. I should say that. It was drug charges over a number of years. It's out in Oregon. He makes organic bread. He makes this white bread. It's phenomenal, right? And it's not like Wonder Bread white bread. It's like called white bread done right, so you feel like it's a little better for you, right? And he actually hires folks with a criminal record, so he tries to give people a second chance. Like, okay, that's a great thing I can support, right? That's awesome. So I'm going through the checkout line. I'm buying this bread, and I bought a loaf of this white bread because I was going to make some French toast, right? It's like good bread for that if you're not like going to buy like a sourdough or something, right? And the guy at the checkout, like working at Kroger, says, "Hey, you want to hear the good thing Hitler did?" And at that point, I need these groceries, and I'm thinking, I don't really want to hear this. At the same time, I don't want to tell that guy no, because when that's he's not really saying anything to me. Just, got your Kroger Plus card? Hey, you want to hear something good Hitler did? I was like, no. I don't think I. And he proceeded to tell me that apparently Hitler outlawed white bread, and that's what he told me was the good thing that he did. And I thought, well, I think that's a drop in the bucket, buddy, but please bag my groceries and let me leave. And I tried to get out of there as quickly as I could. So I didn't want to be in that conversation. You ever get in those conversations? Like, how do I get out of this one? Because I'm literally trapped here. I'm going to have to crawl over a register to get out. So I had a cart in front of me because I was loading my groceries in. Well, there you go. We weren't ready for that story. It has nothing to do with language. Well, I guess it does. It's poor language. You shouldn't say. All right, so we've talked about aphasia, pyrolexia. That's a loss of the ability to read. How many of you have heard of dyslexia, right? Okay, folks hear of dyslexia a lot, right? They're, unfortunately, as is often the case, people take a word and sort of misapply it to something, right? Hey, Casey, have you ever read that DSM, what is it now, 5? Yeah, dyslexia is not in there, is it? I think it's called a reading disorder. I don't believe they use the word dyslexia. Yeah, so they've kind of gotten rid of that. Part of that is people are using the word dyslexia wrong, right? People will use the word. How many of you have ever heard, or maybe you've done this yourself, you've been writing a word and you flipped a couple letters and you go, oh, I'm dyslexic. That is completely wrong. If you're anything, you're dysgraphic, right? And probably you're not even that. But that's a whole separate issue. So we'll talk about being dysgraphic in a moment as well. But there are different kinds of dyslexia. It does not mean you mix your words up necessarily, right? There are different kinds of reading disorders that you can have. We'll talk about those. The same thing with the word schizophrenic, right? You're like, oh man, I was so schizophrenic about that I want chocolate or vanilla ice cream. That's not what that means. Schizophrenic means you think the ice cream is telling you to go kill someone. That's different, okay? Because you have two different opinions, you're not schizophrenic, right? You know people like that, right, Casey?
Yes.
All the time. All the time. No. You hear voices, you're schizophrenic. Can't make up your mind about which ice cream to get? Buy both. You've got a freezer. Eat a little each one every day. I don't know. So, different kinds of reading. How many of you learn to read? I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, assuming you can all read, right? If not, you're doing a great job faking it. So, when you learn to read, there are a couple ways that you learn to read, right? How many of you know like sight words? So they still teach people that, right? And then there's the hooked on phonics. You guys remember those hooked on phonics? Yeah, you guys probably just made fun of those. Those were big when I was a kid, right? It's like, wow, phonics. So the idea about phonics is like you're going to decode a word based on its sounds, right? So it's kind of like sound reading. So when you see the word, like now, there are a ton of words you have that are just sight words. How many of you know the word cat? You don't have to sound that out, right? But how many of you remember when you were little and you had to go, cat, right? And you had to kind of like sound that word out. Now, you still use phonetic reading, probably a lot in this class, right? How many of you read the book and you came across the word amygdala, right? And at first you were like, amygdala, okay. And then, you know, hopefully quickly became a sight word, right? There are a ton of other words now that you probably didn't realize that have now become sight words for you. So great job on that, amygdala being one of them. I've seen that one a bunch. So the idea is you want to get those words that you have to read phonetically. Once you get used to them, you know, they'll just be whole words. You kind of read that on sight, which is kind of interesting. There is something called surface dyslexia. This is kind of an interesting phenomenon. For surface dyslexia, these are folks who have to read every word phonetically. Okay? They are not able to do sight words. Now that's going to be tricky. Well, it's going to be difficult because it takes a lot of time, right? I remember when my nephew, he's 11 now, when he was like learning to read, and I don't really have much like patience, and he's like, he was trying to like, you know, find what he wanted. I went, you know, I was like, oh jeez, you want chicken nuggets? Just tell him. Please, let's get this over with. I'm tired. I had to take you to the go-kart place today. I don't know. Right? So it takes a long time to read phonetically, so you definitely want to read like sight words. He's 11 now, he can read a little faster. Like chicken nuggets, doesn't even look at the menu. Take him out to eat, he's like, oh, just give me chicken nuggets. It's like, all right. But how many of you have ever, I'll tell you another story. So how many of you have ever seen irregularly spelled words, right? And this happens. So a friend of mine, this was when I was in graduate school, we had this awesome machine that would heat up little glass tubes and you pulled them apart and it made these sharp points that you could stick inside of a brain cell and then measure the electrical activity of that, right? And so we talked about this kind of stuff before. So we were making a bunch of these one day and the heating element went out. Because you've got to like heat that glass tube and then pull it tight, right, and fast. So the heating element went out. And there were two kinds of heating elements. There's ones that go all the way around it called a box element, and there's one that's really only like half of a box. And my friend said, we need to order, my friend, by the way, I should tell you was from China. He said, we need to order a TRO element. I was like, what are you talking about, a TRO heating element? He's like, you know a TRO. I was like, no, I don't know a TRO. He's like, it's shaped like this, it's a TRO. I was like, you're going to have to write this down. Trough. It's like, oh man, that's a trough. Horses, pigs, trough. They eat out of troughs. It's not a tro. He's like, yeah, but that's spelled just like though. It's like, yeah, that it is. But it's not said that way. It's different. Believe me, it's trough, just like enough, right? For whatever reason. O-U-G-H you can use as anything in the English language. I promise you. Because enough, trough, through, those things don't make any sense, right? So, if you have surface dyslexia, you're going to go through and it's going to be very hard for you to read the word enough, enoag, right? I mean, you're going to really try to like read that phonetically, and that doesn't make any sense. You're going to have some difficulties there. Direct dyslexia, this is when you can read, but you have no idea what's going on. Okay? You can read familiar words, so this is typically, people aren't born with direct dyslexia. This typically happens from a brain injury later in life. So you can read the familiar words, but if you were coming to this class, you had direct dyslexia before you got here, you're not going to be able to read amygdala, right? That word's going to trip you up because you can't read it phonetically. There's also what we call phonological dyslexia. This is when you can read by whole words, but you can't sound them out. This is a little different than direct dyslexia because up here you have that component where you don't understand what you're saying. Here you do understand what you're saying. And this is going to involve what's called the visual word form area. Not surprisingly, because language and written language is so important to us, we have a brain region that's sort of exclusively devoted to looking at these words in the form of those words and helping us sort of figure out what's going on. Thankfully, there is a ton of plasticity there. And Kyle, if you've ever tried to learn a language that didn't use those nice 26 letters in the English alphabet, and they use other characters, right? Using that visual word form area becomes very, very important for that, right? If you were learning a language that basically used the same sort of characters that we use in the English language, that's not as difficult, right? Because you're used to those sort of characters, those letters. If you're trying to learn something that's different, then that uses different characters or different structures for the letters or word segments, phonemes, however they break that up to syllables, and that can become challenging. All right, there are developmental dyslexias, right? Not a big deal there. You guys know about that. Let's skip through this. Basically, here's how you read things. You look at a word. If you know the word, you can go through that whole word. Recognition. If you don't know it, then you have to go through each letter and the phonetic coding, right? And so we can break this down based on whether or not you have surface dyslexia or phonological dyslexia, as we just talked about. So you can look at these two slides and figure out, what's going on there. There's your visual word form area, tucked in right there on the bottom. What's sort of interesting is it's not very far from the, how many of you remember the fusiform face area? It was down under there as well, right? And that was the part of your brain that was really great at noticing minor differences between people's faces. And the visual word form area is the part of your brain that's really great at noticing minor differences in words and letters, or the characters that make up those words. And this is really great because it's out of focus. so just add to that difficulty there. So if you look at some of these, if you're familiar with any of these other languages, great. If you're not, the point's just going to be even that stronger for you, right? If you look at the word cars and ears, to someone who is not thinking about these letters, they're very similar, right? The only difference really is this small line right there on the E. And that makes a huge difference, right? Is it a car or is it an ear? That little segment, that little line that goes right in here, huge difference. It's not even the entire letter. It's just part of the letter. C, E. And if you're sort of, this is one of those like, which is different, right? And you try to go through here and you find these small sort of differences. You can go here with these sort of other languages here. We have Arabic. You can see there's some small differences sort of here. Hindi as well. There's an extra segment here. And then for Mandarin, you have just a little bit of a top sticking up for the difference between man and sky. So your visual word form area is going to help you recognize these differences. I'm going to assume most of you are familiar with English, and most of you are not familiar with at least one of the other languages there, so you can kind of make that example, highlight that. If I were to just flash these two characters up, you might go, oh, well, those are the same. It's going to take you some time to like find that difference. If you were sort of fluent in reading Hindi, then you would be able to definitely notice the difference quickly. Does that work? It's just another example of that. Don't worry about that too much. All right, we should talk about dysgraphia. Right? This is people who hate charts. That was kind of, I thought that was a good joke. It was a good graphing joke. Jawan laughed. I don't know why. Reminds me of, have you seen any of Dimitri Martin's stand-up? Do you guys know Dimitri Martin? Yeah, I think he's hilarious, right? So I just watched his, I don't know, maybe a couple months ago, I watched the Overthinker, his new special on Netflix, and he has that chart, like, here's where I thought that joke was going to go, but here's how you responded to it. I thought that was kind of funny. You should watch Dimitri. Have you seen any of his work? It's really dry. It's kind of funny though. I mean, he has more Netflix specials than I do, so I'm going to assume he's had some success at that. Which I think he just has one on Netflix, but he had a show briefly. You guys ever watched that? Didn't go well, did it? Yeah, it didn't last long. And then he was in that insurance commercial where he's like trimming the hedges or something. That was like a weird place to see him. Yeah. I think he had a couple kids in the meantime, and I think he spent some time with them. So, dysgraphia, so I think about graph here, like writing, drawing. So it's a disruption in your writing, okay? Involves some issues with motor memory. What's interesting about this is folks who are dysgraphic, when they write something, they will leave out words. Their sentence structure won't be that great, and this is not because they're not practiced, right? This is not because they went to an underfunded high school and they were never trained to write a good paper, right? This is because they actually have some neurological issues where they're not able to get those words onto the paper, right? What's interesting though, they can go back and they can read what they've wrote and recognize it's wrong. And they can recognize like, oh, that's really bad. And then so what they'll do is they have to go through multiple times to edit and revise until they can get things the way they want them to, right? So if you guys are going to write, I don't know, some of you have sent me an email. I'm going to assume you probably didn't spend hours putting that email together. You probably wrote it once. You might have read over it and you go, oh, well, I meant to, left out a word, added a space, whatever. You get it fixed and you send it. If you're dysgraphic and you're trying to do that, you may have to read that 10 or 15 times just to send a 2-line email to let me know you're not going to be in class, right? So you can imagine how long that takes you to do things. So that's a challenge. I think eventually, as voice recognition software gets better, folks with dysgraphia will have a little bit easier go of it, because then they can just like talk into their device. It'll type it for them, and then they can go back and proofread that once or twice and hopefully get things where they need to be. So there you go, great technology coming down the pike. And it is pike, by the way, not pipe, for those of you that put a P in there instead of a K. Just want to correct you on that. Some people do that. It's coming down the pipe. No, it's not. I promise. It's not. It's pike. Just like the fish. It's not a fish, but it's a long story. Don't worry about that too much. Here's your nice chart for the breakdown of reading disorders. Tells you whether you can do whole word or phonetic reading. Gives you a little bit of a idea about where that brain is. And just some idea about what you can or cannot do, right? If you have some difficulties with that or not. Which is kind of interesting.
Is there very much comorbidity between these? Like when you have one, you also see another type of disorder since it's all language.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know that there is. If it's not a developmental disorder, there wouldn't necessarily be a reason for there to be comorbidity, because it would be because of brain damage, right? Now, if your brain damage was extensive enough, obviously you'll see some spread of that. If it's a developmental disorder, developmental issue, you might see some other things that are going on. Sort of depends on what the nature of that, what that developmental issue is. But that's actually a good question. Yeah, you can imagine if someone had trouble reading and writing, they were dysgraphic and they had a couple forms of dyslexia or something. That would, especially in today, right? I mean, it would be a very difficult time. If you were, a few years ago, it may not be as difficult, right? I mean, I think what's probably surprising to me sometimes is the number of people that you or I would know that might actually have some reading difficulty. People are a little embarrassed of it sometimes. There's no reason to be. If you have some trouble reading, okay, work on that. If you have some trouble writing, okay, work on that. We've got resources for you here. Take advantage of those. I don't really have any comment on how good the writing center is, but we have a writing center. You're paying for it, so you might as well go over and irritate those people, right? That's the way I look at it. So, yeah, you don't realize how much. I mean, it's not even. You think, well, like, oh, I can do a lot of stuff without real. Well, I don't know, right? What about operating your car even? I mean, like recognizing the numbers and the things that come up on your dash, trying to read the map or the GPS. Road signs, yeah, road signs are a big one, right? Some of you can know by shape, right? You can go like, oh, okay. But what about those, I see them all the time, like lane closed, right? I mean, how are you going to, I mean, obviously there's like the big arrow, but you got to be prepared for that stuff, right? And even those arrows may or may not make sense to you. It's a symbolic representation, right? So it's not just letters that are going to give you trouble, it's other symbols, right, as well. I mean, if you have some trouble processing symbols, it's going to extend to other characters too, besides, like, you know, just the alphabet. So it becomes a real challenge for folks. So please don't use the word dyslexic lightly, right? And that's kind of my point. It's not because, oh, I flopped the E and I in neighbor. Who cares? You know, you probably don't know how to spell it anyway. Just move on, you know. It's not a big deal. So there you go. You ever think about that too, like how much time people used to spend learning how to spell words, and then now we just get the little red line underneath of it, or the autocorrect? You gotta watch the autocorrect though. Sometimes it'll send things that you didn't mean to. Completely change the sentence. So you gotta read those. Questions about that? Here's your dysgraphia. I'm not going to ask you a whole lot about that, but understand a little bit of it. Just like you have whole word reading and phonetic reading, you have whole word writing and phonetic writing as well. I should mention that, right? How many of you, who here has an extremely long name, like they have to write? I'm trying to like look around at people's. Yeah, you're 7 letters. You're probably our winner, right? I was like looking around. It was like 3, 4, 3, 4, 4, 5, 3, 5, 4. You know, it's like how many letters do people? You know, yours is twice as long as some people, right? And so probably though you just write your name. You don't even think about it, right? You just like, name and you're done. So that's like whole word writing. Now, if I were to write your name, I might have to. Take me a little bit of time, right? Because I have to write that phonetically and kind of have to spell that out in my head. And it's the same thing with other words as well, right? Things that you write on a regular basis. You can do that whole word writing. It comes out pretty smoothly. You probably don't even think about it. You just scribble through it. Then there are going to be words that are going to be longer words that, even long words eventually will become whole words, but some of those you're going to have to, like, let's take a moment. I'm going to write medial prefrontal cortex. I'm going to take my time on that, right? And you do that. That's kind of cool, right? Questions about that? Comments, concerns? I thought I had one more point I wanted to tell you guys about. I guess not. That's fine. Alright, well, I'd like to stop there for the day. I'm sure you would too.